children of America a good education, and today begins a new era.
Worst school cheating scandal in this country.
178 of them should be lined up right now, marching in shame out of Atlanta Public Schools.
It's like their job was on the line, their license were on the line, their freedom was on the line.
She said, I'm from New York, I know how to swim with the sharks. I mean, it's sort of this almost mafia-sounding language that she used to intimidate people into doing what they want, what she wanted. I'm Alan Judd. I'm an investigative reporter for the AJC. Test scores became the be-all and end-all in education in the 2000s. Part of that was from the No Child Left Behind law that was passed by Congress in the early 2000s.
George W. Bush.
It's time to come together to get it done so that we can truthfully say in America, no child will be left behind, not one single child.
The law, No Child Left Behind, was written so that there were benchmarks every year that increased year after year. It was this high stakes testing. There was a mandate that all students had to be proficient, meaning pass, that all students in different segments, whether they were African American, Hispanic, on free and reduced lunch, with special needs, that they would all be testing proficient by a deadline. And all of the schools across the country were sort of readjusting everything in their operations to figure out how to get these kids to pass tests under this deadline. The pressure ratcheted up every year to hit that, 100% proficiency mark.
Teachers just feel this enormous pressure, and they don't want their schools to be labeled failing. They don't want to be in the newspaper as failures.
So at the time, Atlanta was a bit of a Cinderella story.
First of all, I accepted the invitation to share with you the coming together of an entire community in Atlanta around a school system that was stagnant. Since 2000, the district has posted academic gains every year with no slippage, even as the state continues to raise the bar. 8 years ago, only 47% of our fourth graders met or exceeded standards in reading. We were trailing the state by 18 points. Today, that gap has just about disappeared. I invite everyone here to, when you have an opportunity, to visit Atlanta Public Schools and see for yourself the tangible evidence.
I'm John Perry. I'm part of the data journalism team here. And basically what we do is data analysis to support investigative reporting. The state was incorporating a new math curriculum one grade at a time, and when it got to the eighth grade math test was a high stakes test that theoretically the students had to pass it to get to high school. And when the new curriculum came into the eighth grade, 40% of the kids in the state flunked the math test. But then in the fall, the state announced that more schools in Georgia had made their No Child Left Behind goals than ever before, and that just didn't make sense. For the story, we just picked out 4 schools that had extremely unusual test improvement. So the schools were all 4 standard deviations above the mean in their test improvement. So one of the testing experts we talked to told us basically that the improvements at that school the probability would be about the same as having a snowstorm in Atlanta in July.
There was just a lot of a lot of things that didn't really add up and didn't make much sense.
We started getting phone calls from teachers, anonymous phone calls. They wouldn't share their name because they were afraid of the consequences, but they started talking about some of the things that was going on in their classrooms or at their schools.
Some sources kind of came out from the shadows to sort of give some tips.
And so we decided that we should look statewide. We found 19 schools that had very highly unusual increases from 2008 to 2009, and 12 of them were Atlanta Public Schools.
The school district put together what they called the Blue Ribbon Commission. It was a bunch of business leaders in town and some others who did their own investigation of sorts and found, while there was some cheating here and there, it wasn't systematic.
The state came in and actually analyzed the erasures on the test papers and found a very highly unusual pattern of wrong to right changes in the tests, which confirmed a lot of what we'd found out. The schools we pointed out also had, again, very high rates of wrong to right answer changes.
The statistical likelihood of being able to change that many answers from wrong to right from erasing them and doing them again was just astronomically, essentially impossible. We're talking about, one in not even one of the trillion. It goes beyond numbers that most people even can comprehend.
And the other unusual thing we found was on top of the huge jumps, there were also huge drops from year to year at some of the schools. And it turned out it was because one teacher one year was cheating and the teacher the next year was not cheating. And the education experts we were talking to said that just doesn't happen. Kids don't suddenly become dumb in math after being really good at it the year before.
At a middle school, the testing coordinator was not in on the scheme to change the scores. In fact, he was opposed to that idea, but the principal made up an excuse to have him leave the building one day to be gone to an outside event. The principal and some of his teachers went into the office, took pictures of how he had the test papers arranged on his desk, picked them all up, took them away, changed them, came back, and then based on the pictures, put them back where they were. And he never knew. At the same school, they got into the testing booklets ahead of time. Those booklets come in shrink-wrapped plastic packaging. The principal called a teacher in and said, "Do you know how to do this? You know how to break into something?" And the guy goes, "Sure." And he takes a pocket knife and he slits open the plastic, takes out the tests, which were supposed to be kept under lock and key, basically. Took them out, photocopied them so they could get an answer sheet done ahead of time, put them back in, and then used a lighter to melt the plastic back in place to try to avoid being detected. So they had there were a lot of pretty creative ways that were used. There was lots of testimony and lots of evidence about schools would get groups of teachers together to just go through en masse and fix all the answers before they turned them in. And one school even had the sort of infamous margarita party at somebody's house where they, over many drinks, they sat and went through the entire school's test pages. It was a pretty open secret in a lot of schools what was going on. People knew about it, but the ones who weren't participating in it were afraid to say anything.
And this prompted the governor to order those schools to conduct their own investigations. And then he wasn't satisfied with the Atlanta internal investigation, so that's when he sent in his own investigators.
When educators have failed to uphold the public trust and students are harmed in the process, there will be consequences.
Dr. Beverly Hall, who was appointed superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools in 1999. She was recently honored with the Council of Great City Schools National Urban Superintendent of the Year Award.
Beverly Hall had come in as superintendent in, I think, 99, and pretty quickly began to require that teachers get scores up, period. Principals would be reassigned if they weren't. It was a very, very iron fist that she ruled with. We were told an anecdote by a couple of principals who attended her first meeting with all the principals from APS. And she told them to look around the room because 90% of them would be gone in a year. And she had some story about, she said, I'm from New York, I know how to swim with the sharks. I mean, it's sort of this almost mafia sounding language that she used to intimidate people into doing what she wanted.
So Atlanta Public Schools had become a model of the school reform movement, and Beverly Hall had become a star, and she was doing speaking tours, and she was the chairman of the Great City Schools, and had become pretty much a celebrity based on the test improvement that she was showing in Atlanta Public Schools. And she was kind of the darling of the Gates Foundation and the Broad Foundation and these foundations that were pushing a certain kind of corporate management style to reform schools.
Well, she promoted herself and what she called this remarkable transformation of the Atlanta schools. It became a narrative that she disseminated, and then a lot of people in the business community bought into it because it was good for business. If you're looking, if you're doing economic development and the school system is really bad, that's going to make it tough to bring in new business. If things are looking up and the scores are up and it looks like there's a lot of achievement going on and a lot of changes, that's good. So a lot of people in town were just perfectly happy to believe what she was saying, even when it wasn't true.
One of the excuses the Atlanta Public Schools tried to make was high student turnover at these schools. So it wasn't, we were comparing 2008 test scores to 2009 test scores, and they were saying, well, it's not the same kids because kids come and go at these schools a lot. But we looked into that, and for example, the DeKalb County schools have a higher turnover rate than Atlanta Public Schools, but their test scores looked absolutely normal compared to Atlanta Public Schools. So it didn't seem like turnover rate explained any of that. They also claim that, well, there's always outliers, but the fact was that they had an overabundance of outliers, and that was the thing that was hard to explain.
But then they said, well, our kids are more prone to erase than other kids. So they had that was an excuse. Beverly Hall had said there was no reason for anybody to cheat because they were doing so well. She would accuse us of, and anybody else who questioned it, of believing that poor black children can't learn. That was her kind of defense, which was absurd, of course, but she was very strong in denying it, very combative about it, but ultimately acknowledged, not that she did anything wrong, but she acknowledged that other people did.
I will have no other comment than what I issued on Sunday.
Knew nothing about any of this cheating before?
Knew absolutely nothing about cheating.
Hall received bonuses every year from the school board that were based almost entirely on the scores that the schools produced. And it was a total several $100,000 over a few years of bonuses. She was also paid pretty well as school superintendents go, but she received substantial bonuses based on more than any other factor, based on the scores that were turned in every year. There was such a focus on increasing the test scores at any cost. We heard stories about how at the annual convocation for all school teachers and administrators every year before the school year started, they would bring them down to the Georgia Dome and have a big meeting. And if your test scores were good, you got to come down in a limousine and you sat up front. And if your test scores were bad, you took a school bus and you sat up in the stands. So it's an obvious incentive to perform at the level that the district had set. We also began hearing about teachers who reported their suspicions of cheating. They ended up being in trouble more often than the people who actually did the cheating. They would be placed on probationary status, basically, which made it almost impossible for them to get other jobs if they wanted to leave. They were kind of ostracized from their faculty groups. You know, it was very uncomfortable for those people. We talked to one woman who actually was required to see a psychiatrist because she was saying that there had been cheating going on in her school, and in fact, years later, it was proven there was. She was right all along.
When you're accusing the National Superintendent of the Year of basically fraud, then you tend to be very careful before you go public with it. Those first few stories were kind of nerve-wracking because we're, you know, accusing people of possibly cheating based on a statistical analysis. And this is an organization that had not only a big PR budget, but also access to PhD statisticians. We spent a lot of time bulletproofing our analysis. We spent a lot of time trying to think up ways where cheating wasn't the most likely answer for why this was happening. And all the education experts were telling us that what Atlanta Public Schools were doing, the huge test score jumps they were making, the education community just didn't know how to do that. And unless the Atlanta Public Schools could point out to something highly unusual that they had come up with, then these jumps were unlikely.
Most surprising.
When the state's investigation report came out, they identified 178 educators, including 38 principals, that they accused of cheating.
I think it was really hard for people to see the mug shots of educators. I think it was really hard for people to see educators in handcuffs and in a trial setting. I think that there was, you know, an appetite for justice, for, you know, this not to go unnoticed and unexcused. But at the same time, I do feel like there was some sympathy for some of these people who were educators, because in some people's opinions and in some people's minds, they weren't, you know, dangerous criminals. I think, you know, there was some sympathy that was extended.
They ended up with 35 indictments. 21 pled guilty.
Beverly Hall never actually stood trial because she had a recurrence of breast cancer. She actually did pass away at that point. There were very few people who were defending her anymore by that point. I mean, her supporters in the business community had jumped ship, and it was widely seen that she was the mastermind of this whole scandal. There were thousands of children who were not getting an education in the way that they should have. In some cases, almost not at all. And the people in charge of the school system seemed to be promoting themselves over the children. I think if we weren't there looking out for the interest of those kids, nobody else was going to do it at that point, because everybody else wanted to believe her story that she had fixed the schools in Atlanta.